Today, we're diving into 15 horrifying caving disasters, stories of adventure turned to tragedy, where explorers face nature's raw power and the ultimate test of survival. On the morning of 31st August 2015, four experienced cavers, Bob Goforth, Mark Panzing, Adam Zipkin, and Mike Van Note, gathered at the entrance of Raspberry Cave in Arizona. Armed with tools, ropes, and headlamps, they were eager to explore the cave's narrow passages, hoping to uncover new chambers or hidden leads. Their goal that day was to dig through mud and rock in hopes of discovering new sections of the cave. After checking their gear and mapping out their plan, they made their way toward the cave entrance. Raspberry Cave, hidden among the rocky basalt terrain, had an entrance barely wide enough to squeeze through. Late in the morning, they squeezed through the cave's narrow entrance, which led them into a small room just large enough to sit in. From there, they descended into a much larger room with massive boulders precariously wedged into the ceiling above them. At the base of this room was a narrow 10-foot climb down into a smaller chamber, which led to a crawl space about 12 feet long, connecting them to yet another small room. The second small room had a promising lead, so the four men began digging out wet mud and rocks, passing the debris back through the tight crawl space to be deposited in the room they had passed through. As they worked, exhaustion began to set in, and concerns about the stability of the cave walls started to grow. The ceiling above the lead they were working on was made of unstable limestone, and it didn't take long before they realized it might not be safe to continue. Deciding to call it a day, they began packing up their tools. Bob Goforth was the first to exit, making his way back through the crawl space and out of the cave. Mark Panzing was next, climbing up toward the larger room while passing tools ahead of him. As he was working his way out, his shoulder bumped the boulder, and his world suddenly shifted from cautious exploration to sheer terror. The massive rock above him groaned and slid, pinning his head brutally between the unforgiving limestone and the cave wall. His face was smashed against the rough stone, the jagged edges biting into his skin as his helmet strap dug painfully into his throat, restricting his breathing. He could feel the immense pressure building, the boulder threatening to crush him with every second. His mind raced. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe properly, and the weight of the situation was unbearable. Below him, the room was unstable, ready to collapse with one wrong move. Every frantic breath he took scraped his face against the sharp rock, and the panic set in. He tried to loosen his chin strap, but his hands shook uncontrollably and the strap wouldn't budge. His only thought was that any moment, the entire structure could give way, burying not just him, but his companions trapped below. Time seemed to stretch, every second filled with the fear of suffocation or collapse. Just as the panic seemed overwhelming, he called out to Mike Van Note, who was still in the crawlway below. Van Note hurried to him, finding Panzing trapped, his face pressed painfully against the rock and his footing unstable. When he reached him, he saw that Panzing was struggling to free himself while trying to prevent the unstable boulder from crashing down and endangering everyone below. Panzing's chin strap was keeping him stuck and strangling his throat. Despite his efforts to undo it, it wouldn't release. Panzing asked for a knife to cut the strap, and as Van Note passed it up, the situation suddenly shifted. With a loud crack, the boulder shifted again, freeing Panzing's head, but sending a cascade of mud and debris tumbling down into the room below. Rocks clattered and splashed into the wet mud as Van Note scrambled back to avoid the falling debris. Thankfully, the massive boulder didn't fall completely. It wedged itself into the chimney above them, creating a precarious but stable position. For a tense moment, they held their breath, waiting to see if the entire structure would collapse. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the remaining cavers knew they couldn't move the boulder on their own. For 20 minutes, they waited, hoping Goforth, who had exited earlier, would return. Fortunately, Goforth re-entered the cave to check on them after noticing their delay. When he learned they were trapped, they carefully passed him a crowbar from below. With the boulder now wedged in place, Bob Goforth wasted no time. Armed with the crowbar, he began carefully widening the narrow chimney, his every move deliberate and precise. The cavers below could hear the scraping of metal against rock as Goforth worked to create enough space to dislodge the looming boulder. Mud and small rocks occasionally trickled down, raising the tension even further. Mike Van Note kept his eyes on the ceiling, ready to shout a warning if the unstable rock shifted again. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Goforth managed to leverage the boulder into a more stable position. The rock shifted slightly, sending another wave of mud cascading into the room, but this time, it held. The three trapped cavers exchanged relieved glances, their ordeal nearly over. One by one, they carefully climbed up the now wider chimney, each move calculated to avoid disturbing the boulder any further. The climb felt slow, their bodies tired and covered in mud, but as they emerged into the larger room, the sense of relief was palpable. They had escaped what could have been a fatal disaster. On August 18th, 15-year-old Tim Smafield and his twin brother Tom set out for an adventure they had eagerly anticipated for weeks. Both were avid explorers, having spent much of their childhood navigating the forests, lakes, and hills surrounding their Arkansas home. This time, their destination was Devil's Den Cave. The hike to the cave entrance took them through dense forest, the familiar chirping of insects filling the air, and the ground beneath their feet grew increasingly rocky. They passed along the edges of crystal-clear lakes before they finally reached the cave's entrance. A gaping hole in the hillside greeted them, cool air seeping out from its depths, inviting them into the darkness. There was a thrill in the unknown, and neither of the brothers hesitated as they made their way inside. Devil's Den Cave had a reputation for its tight squeezes and deep crevices, but for two experienced explorers like Tim and Tom, these challenges only added to the excitement. As they walked deeper into the cave, their headlamps cut through the inky blackness. The cave had an eerie beauty, with smooth water-carved stone and sparkling mineral deposits lining the narrow passages. The air grew cooler the further they ventured, but it was the right-hand crevice, a fissure in the rock, that caught Tim's attention. It was a narrow, 9-inch wide crack, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Tom hesitated for a moment, suggesting they stick to easier sections of the cave, but Tim's curiosity got the better of him. He had always been the more daring of the two, the one willing to take risks for the thrill of discovery. Ignoring Tom's caution, Tim squeezed his way into the crevice, determined to see how far it went. As he made his way down into the 20-foot-long, 15-foot-high, and 9-inch wide crack, the walls pressed against his body, forcing him to twist and contort his frame to inch deeper. His foot suddenly hit a fragile patch of rock at the bottom of the crevice, and with no warning, it slipped. Tim's left leg became jammed in the narrow space, wedged tightly between two unforgiving rock faces. His other leg, already resting on the slick walls, gave way as well, causing him to stretch awkwardly, pinned between the rock in a painful and precarious position. A wave of panic rushed through him. He called out for Tom, his voice strained. His left leg was stuck, and the right leg, which had slipped, was pulling his lower body down. The pressure on his trapped leg was unbearable, and the pain shot up through his knee and ankle. Worse, the walls were too tight for him to adjust his position. Tim felt like his body was being torn apart, battling the agonizing stretch on one side and the crushing weight on the other. Tom, hearing his brother's cries, rushed to the crevice. He crouched at the top, trying to get a better look. The narrow gap made it impossible for him to reach down and help his brother. Tim's leg was stuck fast, and there was no way Tom could pull him out on his own. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Tom bolted out of the cave, sprinting through the forest, his heart pounding in his chest. By 5:30 p.m., Tom had reached the park's visitor center, breathlessly telling the rangers what had happened. Jeremy Bruce and Tim Scott, two experienced park rangers, grabbed their rescue gear and followed Tom back to the cave without hesitation. As they trekked through the familiar landscape, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. When they arrived at the cave entrance, they were met by the cool, damp air rushing from its depths. Bruce and Scott quickly assessed the situation, preparing themselves mentally for what they might encounter in the tight, dark passageways. Upon reaching the right-hand crevice, they realized Tim was far deeper in the crack than they had expected. The narrow passage made it difficult even to see him clearly. His voice echoed faintly up through the rock, strained with pain. The rangers quickly realized that the situation was more complex than they had hoped. It wasn't just a matter of pulling Tim free. His foot was jammed tightly, and any wrong move could worsen his injuries or send him deeper into the crevice. With no time to lose, the rangers decided to try using tubular webbing they had brought. They tossed one end down to Tim, instructing him to tie it around his body. Tim, though in considerable pain, managed to loop the webbing around his torso. Bruce and Scott tried to pull him up, but the narrow crevice and the awkward angle of his body made it impossible to lift him with brute force alone. Tim cried out as the pressure on his trapped leg became too much. Realizing this was a more delicate situation than they initially thought, Bruce called for backup, contacting Park Superintendent Jesse Cox and asking for cave rescue teams to assist. By 7:50 p.m., the cave rescuers had arrived and the group formed a plan. Pulling Tim sideways through the crevice wasn't going to work. The only option was to lift him straight up, but they had to do it carefully. Any misstep could worsen his injuries. They fashioned a loop from the webbing and prepared to hoist him up. Ranger Bruce climbed onto a ledge above the crevice. Positioning himself directly over Tim, he lowered the loop down, encouraging Tim to work it beneath his arms and around his chest. Tim, exhausted and in pain, followed their instructions. As the rescuers began to pull inch by inch, Tim's body slowly started to rise. Every tug brought excruciating pain as his leg fought against the rock, but he knew this was his only chance. His trapped foot finally loosened, and the Rangers pulled him higher until at last, he was within arm's reach of Scott. The team gave a final pull, and with a grunt, they freed him from the rock's grip. It was 8:20 p.m. by the time Tim was pulled from the crevice. His legs were bruised and swollen, but miraculously, he had escaped without any severe injury. On June 14, 2003, deep in the rugged wilderness of Colorado, seasoned cavers Tom Dawson and Bob Sacco set out for an exhilarating day of exploration. Their destination was the land of the Swirling Mists Cave, a newly discovered underground labyrinth that had captured the imagination of local adventurers. The two cavers, eager to uncover more hidden passages and chart new territory, were prepared for a day filled with challenge and discovery. The exploration of the newly discovered land of the Swirling Mists Cave had been exhilarating for Tom Dawson and his partner Bob Sacco. With the discovery of the main level, there was an air of excitement to uncover more of the cave's mysteries. They decided to tackle the south end of the lobby, a large room filled with breakdown piles. Dawson, always up for a challenge, took on the task of digging through the unstable rock, hoping to find a new passage. The air was thick with the damp smell of earth and the distant echoes of dripping water, making the cave feel alive around them. Lying on his side, Dawson began pulling rocks from the pile, inching his way closer to a possible new tunnel. He stayed low, avoiding the larger rocks, trusting his instincts to keep him safe. But then, without warning, a sickening scrape filled the air. Time seemed to slow as a massive slab of rock, about 10 inches thick and several feet wide, broke loose from the ceiling. Before Dawson could react, it dropped onto him with a crushing force. As Tom Dawson lay trapped under the massive slab of rock, his world shrank to the sound of cracking bones and waves of pain. The moment the boulder settled on him, he felt a sharp, sickening pop in his chest, the unmistakable sound of his ribs giving way. Each breath was a jagged gasp, the broken bones grinding together with every shallow inhale. It felt like knives stabbing into his lungs, each movement sending searing pain through his body. Before he could process the agony in his chest, a brutal, white-hot flash of pain shot through his left shoulder. He tried to move it. Nothing. The shoulder was completely dead, hanging limp and useless at his side. Tom realized with a jolt of horror that it had been dislocated, leaving him crippled and trapped. The full weight of the situation hit him as hard as the rock itself. Pinned to the cave floor, his right arm stuck awkwardly above his head. The dislocated shoulder felt like fire, every slight shift making it worse. His body screamed at him with pain from every angle, broken ribs, a ruined shoulder, and the crushing pressure of the slab making it harder to breathe with each passing second. Tom could do nothing but grit his teeth, knowing that if he didn't find a way out soon, the cave might claim him entirely. Pinned to the cave floor, he was crying out of pain, his legs visible to Sacco, who frantically started digging to free him. Sacco dug with everything he had, trying to free his friend, but the situation grew more desperate by the minute. With each rock removed, the slab seemed to settle lower, intensifying the pressure on Dawson's body. The slab suddenly shifted. It first smacked his head, which he tried to hold above, and then its enormous weight pressed down on Dawson's helmet, pinning his head in place. His body could barely move, but now his head held the crushing rock above him. His right arm, now freed, groped for any way to release the chin strap on his helmet. His fingers, numb from the strain, pinched the strap as hard as they could, desperate to break free. At last, with one sharp tug, the strap released. With a final, painful push, Dawson slid his body out from under the rock, just as it slammed into the space he had vacated. His entire body screamed in agony, his ribs burning from the impact, his shoulder hanging limp and dislocated, his head in throbbing pain. But there was no time to think. He had one thought and one thought only: get out. Dawson bolted, leaving behind his helmet, his gear, and even the pain that shot through every step. He needed to get out of that cave. Sacco, running after him, shoved a light into his hand, and Dawson barely paused to take it. He was disoriented and lightheaded, probably concussed, but he didn't care. The only thing driving him forward was survival. He reached the narrow crawlway near the cave entrance, dropping to his hands and knees, his body barely cooperating. As he crawled through the tight space, his head spun, his vision blurred, and his heart raced. Halfway through, he realized the full weight of his injuries. His body was failing him. The pounding in his skull became overwhelming, and his limbs felt weak. He collapsed onto the ground, his world tilting with dizziness. He managed to call for help, his voice weak and strained. His wife, Nancy, who had been near the entrance, heard his cry and rushed to his aid. Grabbing the collar of his cave suit, she dragged him with every ounce of strength she had, while he pushed feebly with his feet, using the cave walls for leverage. Each pull sent waves of pain crashing through his body, his broken ribs grinding against one another. With Nancy's help, he made it out of the crawlway and through the larger passage to the cave's entrance. By the time they reached the outside world, Dawson was on the edge of collapse. His wife sprinted down the hillside to get their phone and call for help. When he reached the car, Nancy was already there, and she sped down to the visitor center where the ambulance waited. Dawson's ordeal wasn't over yet. He was rushed to the hospital, where they discovered the full extent of his injuries: a concussion, several broken ribs, internal bleeding, a dislocated shoulder, and numerous other injuries. It was a day that nearly broke him, both physically and mentally, but Dawson had made it out, barely. Along the stunning coastline of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula lies a world hidden beneath the surface: Sistema Sac Actun. It's a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers stretching over 368 kilometers and is the longest underwater cave system in the world. In December 2004, 9 divers set out to explore Tenote Kalimba, part of this vast underwater network. These were seasoned divers, their skills honed from previous dives. They had built trust, communication, and a camaraderie that made them feel invincible. Yet Sistema Sac Actun, with its twists, turns, and hidden dangers, was about to put them to the ultimate test. As the divers arrived that morning, the sun bathed the lush greenery in gold, its warmth in stark contrast to the cool, dark waters awaiting them below. They gathered by the water's edge, checking their equipment with the precision of astronauts before a space mission. Breathing regulators, tanks, spools of rope, and the brightly colored cookies, small plastic markers used to mark paths, were all checked and rechecked. Each diver knew the importance of these tools. In an environment where visibility could be reduced to inches, they were lifelines. The plan was clear. 2 teams would enter. Team A, led by a guide, would descend first and lay markers along the way. Team B would follow closely behind, retracing their steps back once they reached a predetermined point. The divers nodded in agreement, confidence radiating from each of them. They had been through tougher dives, and this one seemed manageable. Average depths of 33 feet, moderate currents, and well-traveled paths. But the cenote didn't care about their plans. Team A entered the water first, the crystal-clear entrance of Cenote Kalimba giving way to murky depths as they ventured further. The stillness of the cave was broken only by the rhythmic bubbles of their breathing. Following the permanent guideline, they marked their path carefully, knowing that even one wrong turn could lead to catastrophe. Soon, they reached the first intersection. The diver in the lead fixed a yellow cookie to the jump line, marking the safe path for Team B. With the path marked, they continued forward, their movements smooth and synchronized. Everything was going according to plan. Meanwhile, Team B had entered the water. As they followed Team A's path, they reached the first intersection and saw the marker, a reassuring sign that they were on the right track. But unbeknownst to them, a storm of mistakes was brewing. After 32 minutes of travel, Team B arrived at the second marker. Here, they made a critical error. Instead of turning right to follow the path back to the exit, they turned left. It seemed innocent enough, After all, directional markers in the cave pointed them that way, and it was easy to mistake one dark tunnel for another. As they swam deeper into the cave system, the mood began to shift. The cool calmness that had guided their movements was replaced with confusion and an unsettling realization. They weren't where they thought they were. They'd been swimming for 25 minutes since the wrong turn, covering 1,400 feet, deeper into the cave system, away from the exit. Panic began to creep into their minds. The water around them grew colder as tiny particles of silt were disturbed by their frantic movements. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the lines between up, down, and sideways blurred into a disorienting fog. It felt like the cave was swallowing them whole. Back at the surface, Team A had finished their dive. The first to exit, they removed the markers they had placed, unaware that Team B was still inside and hopelessly lost. Meanwhile, Team B found themselves deeper than intended. They paused at an intersection, realizing their mistake too late. One diver unspooled a rope, hoping to find the next permanent line, but his search led to nothing but rock and shadow. They were running out of time, and worse, running out of air. The divers split into two pairs, hoping to find their way back. The lead pair swam ahead, searching for the familiar markers they had seen on the way in. When they reached the intersection where they had gone wrong, they were met with a horrifying sight. No marker, no path to follow, only cold, oppressive darkness. Their hearts raced as the cold reality set in. They were lost. And with panic came another problem. Their air consumption skyrocketed. With each frantic breath, they burned through their tanks faster. It wasn't long before one of the divers found his tank running dangerously low. In a desperate move, he began buddy breathing with his partner, sharing what little air remained between them. At the surface, Team A realized something was terribly wrong. Team B was nowhere to be found, and too much time had passed. Grabbing extra tanks, the guide and several divers plunged back into the water, their hearts pounding with urgency. The search didn't take long. Just 250 feet from the safety of the surface, they found the first pair from Team B, barely alive, gas tanks almost empty, but safe. When asked where the other two were, the lead pair, now gasping for breath, said they had seen the lights of their teammates not far behind. But after waiting a few more agonizing minutes, there was still no sign of the second pair. The rescuers dove back into the cave, hoping against hope that they would find their teammates alive. And then, in the dim glow of their flashlights, they saw them. Two lifeless figures, suspended near the cave's ceiling, regulators floating useless beside them. The rescuers gently pulled the bodies from the cave. Their dive tanks, when checked, showed zero pressure. They had suffocated in the very cave they had come to explore. The Sistema Sac Actun, with its winding passages and silent depths, is a place of wonder, but also a place where nature is unforgiving. For Team B, one simple navigational error cascaded into a series of fatal events, showing that even the most skilled and experienced divers are at the mercy of the elements in this vast underwater world. It was a crisp, clear morning on April 26, 1982, when James May stepped out into the world, a young man of 21, with a heart full of arrogance and a mind brimming with overconfidence. James had always believed in his ability to conquer any challenge, to bend the natural world to his will, and Huapache Cave near the Cave of the Winds in Colorado seemed no different. His fragile ego was both his strength and his weakness, the very thing that led him to places where most men would hesitate, and it would also lead him to the brink of destruction. James' friends were no strangers to his temper. They knew how quickly pride flared up in him, how easily his ego bruised. When they all set out for the cave that Saturday morning, he walked with his head held high, striding ahead with his usual swagger, believing he could handle whatever the earth beneath their feet threw at him. Dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, knee pads strapped on, and armed with 3 flashlights, James didn't think twice about not carrying food or water. The cave would not beat him, not with extra batteries in his pocket. His companions, perhaps a little wary, perhaps a little tired of his bravado, followed in silence. As they ventured deeper into Huapache Cave, a bitter argument broke out. Perhaps it was James's usual arrogance. Perhaps it was the tension of the narrow spaces and the cold, damp air that gnawed at their nerves. The details of what was said may have been lost to time, but the aftermath was clear. James, filled with anger and pride, turned on his friends. "Leave me! I'll find my own way out." His face twisted with fury as he declared that he didn't need them, and they did. His companions, tired of his outbursts, took him at his word. Perhaps they thought he'd follow after them, tail between his legs, or perhaps they thought the cold darkness of the cave would humble him, but they left. Now, alone in the belly of the earth, James May was master of his fate, or so he thought. The realization came slowly. At first, James reveled in his solitude, convinced he could navigate the maze-like passages on his own. He flipped on one of his flashlights and marched forward, deeper into the cave. His pride kept his fear at bay, but soon the shadows seemed to stretch longer. The echoes of his footsteps grew louder, and the winding passages became disorienting. Hours passed. His companions were long gone, and the way out, which once seemed so simple, now evaded him. He tried one passage only to find it led deeper into the cave. He turned back, tried another route, but it too led to a dead end. His confidence began to wane. The cave was vast, larger than he had imagined, and now he was utterly, hopelessly lost. His throat parched, and his stomach twisted with hunger. The light from his flashlight seemed dimmer now. James sat down on a damp rock, his knees pulled to his chest, panic gnawing at the edges of his mind. He could hear the drip of water somewhere in the distance, the slow, steady sound that reminded him of time passing. Too much time. Night came and went. Though in the cave, time was a meaningless blur. James's flashlights, one by one, they flickered out. He was alone in complete darkness, the cold biting at his skin. His thin shirt and jeans did nothing to keep out the creeping chill of the cave's depths. Shivering uncontrollably, he realized how ill-prepared he truly was. He could feel the weight of exhaustion settling in. He was cold. His body temperature was dropping every minute. Desperation led him to make a fire, a pathetic, sputtering thing. He burned everything he had left, his shirt, his knee pads, even his flashlight batteries, anything to stave off the cold. Eventually, he was left with nothing but his pants and sneakers. His body was bruised and scraped from the cave's jagged walls, and hypothermia began to take over his mind. Delirium set in. His thoughts became fragmented, and his mind wandered into strange dreams of climbing over a stone slab roof, with police chasing him. It was the irrationality of his mind slipping, the mixture of hunger, cold, and fear pulling him deeper into madness. He could barely tell what was real anymore. While James struggled in the darkness, his companions, unaware of the danger he was in, didn't realize the severity of his situation until the next day. When he didn't appear on Sunday, they had previously entered the cave again. They spotted his light in the distance but were startled when he turned it off, refusing to respond to their calls. They thought he was good on his own. It wasn't until his mother, growing concerned over her son's disappearance, informed the El Paso Sheriff's Department. By Sunday night, a search party was assembled, but despite their best efforts, 5 hours of combing through the cave yielded no sign of James. On Monday, at around noon, hope arrived in the form of Barney Foster, someone who knew Huapache Cave better than most. Having heard of the search on TV, he ventured into the cave on his own, determined to find James. While the rescue team had been prepared to let the search fade, knowing James had a habit of disappearing for days at a time, Foster wasn't willing to let the young man die in the depths of that unforgiving cave. Foster pushed through the cave's narrowest passages, places few had dared to go, and in a particularly tight squeeze, he found a flashlight. It was the first sign. He pressed on, deeper into the cave's upper rear portion. Then, in a small room filled with large breakdown blocks, he heard it, a cough. James May lay there, on the cold stone floor, battered and broken, barely clinging to consciousness. He had burned everything but his pants and sneakers to survive, and his body was covered in bruises and scrapes. Foster gave him an energy bar and water, and slowly, carefully, they made their way out. James had survived 54 hours lost in the cave, but barely. James May was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, suffering from severe dehydration, hypothermia, and exhaustion. He was admitted immediately and treated for his injuries, spending weeks under care. During his long recovery, James had time to reflect on the ordeal that nearly cost him his life. The cave had stripped him of his arrogance, humbling him in a way nothing else could. 3 seasoned cavers, John Parker, Leo Sanchez, and Mike Barnes, set out early on a crisp morning, Eager to explore a cave nestled deep within the wild terrain, known locally as Black Eagle Cave, was rumored to have unexplored sections, and the trio was determined to map its depths. With years of experience behind them, they were confident in their skills. They had trekked for miles through dense forests and waded across shallow lakes to reach the remote entrance, prepared with ropes, helmets, harnesses, and extra supplies. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of wildlife. Upon reaching the cave, the men entered without hesitation, navigating its narrow passages with practiced ease. Their headlamps illuminated the winding tunnels as they descended deeper into the earth. The cave was challenging but familiar territory, with tight squeezes, jagged rocks, and slippery walls. But this was the kind of environment they thrived in. As they descended into a deeper section of the cave, something unexpected happened. Mike, who was moving down a steep, narrow drop, placed his left foot on what appeared to be a sturdy rock. But as soon as he applied pressure, the rock crumbled beneath him, his leg jammed awkwardly between two sharp edges, the fragile rock breaking under his weight and wedging his left leg in place. The walls of the cave were slick with moisture, and before he could regain his footing, his other leg slipped down, his body lurching forward. The pain hit immediately. His left leg was twisted unnaturally, and as he tried to stabilize himself, the weight of his body pulled on the trapped leg, stretching the muscles and tendons beyond their limit. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his ankle or knee. It was hard to tell which, but he knew something was broken. His entire lower body was being stretched in opposite directions, the tight confines of the cave pressing in on him. The pain was excruciating, a combination of the sharp agony from the break and the intense tearing sensation, as his muscles strained to keep him from slipping further. He gasped for air, struggling to focus through the pain. Leo and John rushed to his side, but the narrow passage made it difficult for them to reach him directly. The confined space and the unstable rock made every movement perilous. John, the closest to Mike, could see the strain on his friend's face, the agony written in every grimace. Mike's leg was wedged tightly, the rock around it crumbling, and his lower body hung at an unnatural angle. They quickly assessed the situation. The fragile rock was too unstable to pull him free without making things worse. Leo tied a rope around Mike's upper body, securing him to prevent any further slips. They knew they couldn't just yank him out. The break in his leg and the awkward angle would only worsen the injury. Instead, they devised a plan to relieve the pressure. John crawled into the narrow gap beside Mike, wedging himself into the small space to stabilize him. Leo, outside the passage, found a sturdy anchor point and looped a second rope through it. The plan was to use the rope to carefully pull Mike upward, while John helped maneuver his trapped leg free. Every second counted, as Mike's breathing was growing more labored with each passing moment, the pain wearing him down. They began the slow, agonizing process of freeing Mike. Leo applied gentle tension to the rope, lifting Mike's upper body slightly, while John worked to loosen the rocks around his trapped leg. Mike winced with every movement, trying not to scream as the pain shot through his leg. The rock shifted slowly, piece by piece, as John carefully cleared the debris. Finally, the last chunk of rock gave way. Mike's leg was free, but the damage was done. His left ankle was visibly swollen and twisted, and he could barely move it without sharp pain shooting up his leg. They carefully maneuvered him out of the narrow passage and into a larger space, where they could assess his injuries more thoroughly. After that, it took hours, with John and Leo taking turns supporting Mike and guiding him through the tight passages. But they finally emerged from Black Eagle Cave, exhausted but relieved. Mike's leg was broken, but thanks to their quick thinking and careful efforts, he was safe and alive. On Saturday, August 9th, 1980, Bruce Unger, Scott Trosson, Louise Hose, and Tom Strong embarked on an ambitious adventure into the Lost Creek system, a network of caves carved through the rocky landscapes of the Lost Creek scenic area, just outside of Denver, Colorado. The group had chosen the lowermost cave as their target, a section known for its moderate difficulty, but with an added allure. No one had ever completed a full-through trip from the lower entrance to the upper exit. The challenge excited them all, especially Bruce Unger, the most experienced caver among them, who had previously explored caves with high water flow. Despite the risk, the group was confident. They had meticulously prepared for their descent, donning wetsuits to protect against the frigid water that flowed through the cave system. Unger and Trosson, the most experienced of the group, even strapped on seat harnesses over their wetsuits, while the others carried their gear in waterproof packs. They equipped themselves with both carbide lamps and backup electric lights, ensuring they wouldn't be left in the dark if any equipment failed. Safety was paramount, but so was their sense of adventure. By 11:30 a.m., they reached the cave entrance, eager to begin their exploration. Unger took the lead as the group descended into the depths of the cave, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they moved deeper. The passage was narrow at points, and soon the team found themselves navigating through a series of tight boulders, testing both their patience and skill. But this was what they had come for, the thrill of pushing beyond the familiar into the unknown. About 150 feet into the cave, they encountered their first real challenge, a powerful water chute that funneled water down a 2-foot wide, 15-foot long slope at a 30-degree angle. The chute led to a larger room on the other side, but getting there required navigating through the rushing water. Unger, always the brave one, went first. He began to climb the chute, using friction holds on the slippery rock to hoist himself up against the strong current. The others waited in a shallow pool below, listening for any word from him. As he neared the top, Unger yelled down that the chute was slick and advised them to stop climbing until he could find a secure foothold. But suddenly, something went wrong. Unger lost his grip, and in an instant, he was swept down the chute. His body hit the water hard, but he managed to wedge himself, his head and chest above water. However, his left foot had become lodged in the crack. His bulky boot jammed tightly in the rock, and no amount of pulling could free him. He shouted for help, panic creeping into his voice. Louise Hose quickly scrambled up the chute to reach him, while Trosson and Strong prepared below. Hose tried to pull on Unger's leg, but his foot was stuck fast. His boot, too large and rigid, was wedged between the rock surfaces, and the more they tried to free him, the more desperate the situation became. Unger, already exhausted from battling the powerful water, began to panic. He could feel the pressure building as the current pushed against him, threatening to drag him further under the water. Trosson and Strong arrived shortly after, but as they tried to assist Hose, the unrelenting water began to work against them. Hose, in an attempt to reposition herself to hold Unger's head above water, suddenly lost her grip and was swept back down the chute. She collided with Trosson and Strong, creating a chaotic scene in the pool below. Despite the confusion, Strong managed to keep his head above water, and Trosson quickly grabbed Unger again, holding on tightly to prevent him from slipping further. But the situation was growing more dire by the second. Unger, already choking on water, began to thrash in the rushing current. He pleaded, his voice hoarse and filled with fear. Trosson gripped his hand, but the force of the water was too much. Suddenly, Trosson lost his hold, and Unger's head slipped beneath the surface. The current yanked at him violently. They saw his head smashing onto the walls, and before anyone could react, both Trosson and Hose were swept down the chute once again. For a brief moment, the group was plunged into darkness. The carbide lamps had gone out, and only Jose's backup electric light flickered in the cold water. Unger was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as Trosson, determined to save his friend, scrambled back up the chute, his heart racing. He managed to grab hold of Unger's helmet, pulling with all his strength, but the helmet slipped off in his hands. Desperate, Trosson tried again, but lost his footing and was swept back down the chute for a third time. Hose and Strong, grasping the urgency, took off their cave packs and ropes, hoping to lighten their load and climb back up faster. Desperation fueled their attempts, but the relentless water pushed them back each time they neared where Unger had gone under. By now, Unger had been underwater for several minutes, and the chances of survival were fading fast. Strong and Hose knew they had to try one last time, but the physical and emotional toll was weighing on them. Exhausted, they clung to the rock, staring at the chute where Unger had disappeared. When they reached the top and found no sign of him, the truth became clear. Unger was gone. They stood there, staring into the swirling water, knowing what had happened. At 2:45 p.m., they made the difficult decision to exit the cave, leaving behind the body of their friend. There was nothing more they could do. The rushing water had claimed him, and the realization of the loss settled heavily on their hearts. It was a devastating end to what had begun as an exciting exploration, and the group, filled with grief and disbelief, exited the cave in silence. 2 weeks later, on August 23rd, with the water flow reduced to a fraction of its previous strength, a body recovery team returned to the cave. They found Bruce Unger's body wedged beneath a boulder, deep within the chute. It took considerable effort to free him, and only then could they bring him back to the surface. An autopsy later revealed extensive head injuries, including fractures to the skull and neck, likely caused by the violent water flow smashing his head against the cave walls. Although there was some speculation about drowning, the more likely cause of death was blunt force trauma. A key factor contributing to the tragedy may have been the unsuitable footwear Unger wore. His bulky boots with poor traction likely contributed to his initial slip, and once his foot was caught, there was little chance for escape. Further analysis suggested that a more organized and strategic response may have increased the chance of survival. For instance, using a rope to secure Unger's head above water might have given them more time to rescue him. Unfortunately, in the panic of the moment, such options were not considered. In March 1997, two friends, Andrew and Attila, planned on a caving expedition. The anticipation had been building for weeks. They had been planning their trip to Real Well in Tennessee with growing excitement, eager to face the thrill of descending its infamous 160-foot entrance pit. Both had a few caving trips under their belts, though Attila, at 26, was still relatively new to the sport. He had visited only 5 caves previously, but his enthusiasm more than made up for his lack of experience. Andrew, 32 and more seasoned, took the lead in their planning, and they felt confident they had what it took to handle whatever the cave threw at them. Or so they thought. The morning of March 18th arrived with overcast skies and a persistent drizzle. As they approached the cave entrance, they could hear the ominous roar of the water cascading into the pit, louder than expected. Andrew paused, glancing over at Attila, who stood next to the ropes and equipment they had laid out by the mouth of the cave. They had their wetsuits in the car, but looking at the weather and the cold air around them, neither thought they'd need them. The decision to leave those wetsuits behind would become one of many critical mistakes. Despite the waterfall's intensity, they pressed on. Their excitement, perhaps arrogance, dulled their instincts to reconsider. They rigged their ropes directly in the waterfall's path, knowing they'd get wet, but underestimating how quickly the cold would overtake them. Attila, in his rush, hadn't brought a helmet, another crucial oversight, but at the time, the thrill of the descent overpowered thoughts of safety. Andrew rappelled down first, feeling the sting of the cold water hitting his back as he slid deeper into the pit. The waterfall was relentless, a torrent crashing around him, soaking his clothes and skin. By the time he hit the bottom, he was already chilled to the bone. Attila followed soon after, the water pounding down even harder, making the rope feel like a slippery serpent between his gloved hands. Inside the cave, the air was thick with moisture, the walls damp and gleaming in the faint light of their headlamps. The cave was beautiful, but the cold gnawed at them from the start. After only about 30 minutes of exploring, Attila began to feel uneasy. His body was trembling, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as the cold seeped in deeper. "Andrew, I can't stay down here," Attila said, his voice strained and weak, the discomfort apparent. "I think I need to get out." Andrew nodded, understanding that things were quickly going south. "All right, I'll get the ropes ready," he said, his voice steady despite his own discomfort. But the waterfall continued to roar, and even his hands, trained from years of experience, were starting to stiffen from the cold. Attila rigged his climbing system quickly, too quickly in hindsight. His setup consisted of a commercial seat harness and a hand-tied chest harness. Inexperienced as he was, he relied on a Petzl-handled ascender, which is designed to grip the rope as climbers move upward with a cow's tail sling attaching it to his harness. Unfortunately, his cow's tail was far too long, which would soon spell disaster. He also used a Petzl shunt, a mechanical device meant to be a backup safety device, but it too would complicate things. To make matters worse, Attila had rigged a chain of 6 non-locking carabiners to connect his seat ascender to his harness, another dangerous improvisation. Andrew noticed the hurried, jumbled setup and thought about saying something, but before he could, Attila was already on the rope, beginning his ascent. Each handhold was a battle against the freezing water streaming over him, his gear slick with moisture. The waterfall battered him relentlessly as he climbed, making his progress slow and exhausting. The shunt, which he had attached to a long foot sling, was giving him problems. It kept slipping, refusing to hold steady as it should. Halfway up, Attila stopped. His muscles were burning, and the cold had sapped much of his strength. His gear was failing him, piece by piece. The long chain of carabiners connecting his ascender had unhooked, leaving him suspended by the cow's tail, now stretched so far that he couldn't even reach the ascender to adjust it. He tried to communicate with Andrew, shouting through the deluge of water, but his words were swallowed by the deafening roar of the waterfall. "Attila, come back down if you need to," Andrew shouted from below, his voice barely reaching over the torrent. Attila tried to respond, but his words came out garbled, unclear. Minutes stretched into agonizing minutes, the water hammering him, the cold tightening its grip on his body. Finally, Andrew heard him call out, "I can't!" Andrew's heart raced. Attila was stuck, trapped in the waterfall with no way to free himself. Realizing how dire the situation had become, Andrew knew he had to act fast. Without hesitation, he clipped into the rope and began climbing up toward his friend. The ascent was grueling. Every foot he gained felt like a victory as the freezing water sapped his energy and his hands went numb against the wet rope. When Andrew reached Attila, the sight was grim. His friend was hanging limp in his harness, conscious but unable to move, his body nearly paralyzed by the cold. Hypothermia was already setting in, the signs unmistakable, the uncontrollable shivering, the pale skin, the lethargy. Andrew knew that the only way to save Attila was to perform a pick-off maneuver, a technical and often life-saving rescue technique in which the rescuer attaches the stranded climber to their own harness and descends with them to the ground. But under these conditions, with the waterfall pounding down on them and both of them freezing, it was far more difficult than in any training scenario. Andrew struggled to get his gear in place, his fingers numb and clumsy from the cold. He tried to attach Attila to his harness, but each attempt was thwarted by the relentless water and his dwindling strength. He knew the maneuver in theory, had practiced it a handful of times, but never in such extreme conditions. His muscles screamed with effort, his mind growing foggy as hypothermia crept into his own body. After several failed attempts, Andrew realized it wasn't going to work. Desperate, he tried another tactic, climbing out while tethered to Attila. If he could pull his friend up, maybe they could reach safety together. But the added weight was too much. After ascending only 15 feet, Andrew's strength gave out, his body shaking violently from exhaustion and the cold. He couldn't go any further. Now both of them were stuck, hanging in the freezing waterfall. Time was running out, and Andrew knew it. Attila was slipping further into unconsciousness, and Andrew's own body was on the verge of giving in. In one last desperate act, Andrew swung himself over to a ledge, fighting the overwhelming cold and the fatigue that threatened to overtake him. He managed to pull himself onto the ledge and unclip from the rope, collapsing into a trembling heap. His entire body was convulsing from the cold, his clothes soaked through, offering no protection against the elements. He crawled to a drier part of the ledge, his vision blurring, and before he knew it, he passed out. When Andrew finally awoke, hours had passed. His body was stiff and numb, his mind groggy and disoriented. But the reality of the situation came crashing down on him as soon as he saw Attila. His friend was still hanging in the waterfall, motionless. Andrew's stomach twisted with grief, but he knew what had to be done. He re-rigged his equipment, his hands shaking uncontrollably, barely able to manipulate the gear. With a heavy heart, he cut the tether that connected Attila to him. It was clear that his friend was gone. Andrew made the agonizing climb out of the cave alone, every step filled with the weight of what had happened. When he finally emerged, he collapsed and called for help. Rescue teams arrived hours later, finding Attila's body still suspended in the waterfall. A doctor on the scene confirmed what Andrew already knew. Attila had succumbed to hypothermia hours earlier. His makeshift climbing system, the cold and the harsh conditions had been too much. Looking back, it was clear that mistakes had been made from the start. Leaving the wetsuits behind, Attila's unsafe cobbled-together climbing gear, and their lack of experience with such a wet, vertical cave had all contributed to the tragedy. The fatal error was likely when one of the non-locking carabiners in Attila's chain of gear had come undone, leaving him stranded, unable to reach his ascender or his safety devices. On the cold afternoon of November 28, 1985, a group of 7 cavers entered the Culverson Creek Cave in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. The recent record rainfall had caused severe flooding in the area, and the group had wisely abandoned their original plan to explore Friar's Hole, opting instead for a cave that seemed less prone to flooding. They were hopeful that Culverson, though unfamiliar to them, would offer a safer adventure. The cave greeted them with a 5 to 8 foot wide canyon, the floor covered by a shallow stream that flowed swiftly over loose rock slabs. The group pressed forward, unaware of the tragic event that would soon unfold. Only about 50 feet into the cave, they came upon a massive boulder, a 5-foot-tall rock that partially blocked the passage. The group had two choices: to climb over the boulder or to squeeze through a narrow gap between the rock and the cave wall where the stream rushed by. 3 cavers passed the obstacle without incident, carefully making their way through the tight space. Eric Tzakle, a 26-year-old with plenty of caving experience, led the next group of 3. He chose the left-hand route, stepping carefully as he walked through the stream. Just as he reached the center of the boulder, everything changed in an instant. The boulder shifted. It was as though time slowed as the massive rock tilted left, its weight suddenly becoming unstable. The cavers reacted quickly, trying to stop it from moving, but their efforts were futile. The massive boulder crashed into the narrow corridor, pinning Eric between the cave wall and the rock, his body frozen in place. His left temple and shoulder pressed against the cave wall, his right cheekbone trapped against the cold stone of the boulder. His legs dangled beneath him, and though his hard hat stayed on, his body was stuck, completely immobile. The witnesses reported that the weight of the rock pressed relentlessly against his chest, making it harder and harder for him to draw breath. Every shallow inhale felt like fire in his lungs. His heart raced as adrenaline pumped through his veins, but his body remained frozen, locked in place by the unyielding stone. His friends, still in shock, could do nothing but watch. They could see the agony in his eyes, the panic rising as his body grew weaker by the second. The helplessness his companions felt was suffocating. One of them rushed out of the cave to get help, while the others stayed behind, desperately trying to move the boulder. They pushed with all their strength, grunting and straining against the immense weight. But it was futile. The rock was too heavy. They tried to wedge crowbars into place, pulling at the levers with every ounce of strength they had, but nothing worked. All the while, they watched as Eric's breaths grew shallower. Eric remained conscious for about 30 seconds after the rock fall, but for those around him, it felt like an eternity. His shallow breaths were labored, each one weaker than the last. Within moments, his body stopped moving altogether. A small trickle of blood ran from his left nostril, and his pulse, though still strong, was fading fast. One of the cavers tried to prop him up, hoping to relieve the pressure even slightly, but it made little difference. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the distant rush of water and the frantic beating of their hearts. More help arrived in waves. At 4:20 p.m., the group finally had a hydraulic jack in hand. Nearly an hour after the accident, it was clear that time was running out. With a team of rescuers, crowbars, and the jack in hand, they managed to shift the boulder just enough to free Eric's lifeless body. His friends dragged him to a drier part of the cave, just 20 feet away, and immediately began CPR, their hands trembling with the effort. The minutes that followed felt like a race against fate. Every pump of the chest, every desperate breath they forced into his lungs, carried the hope that they could still bring him back. But Eric wasn't responding. His skin had turned pale, and though his body was warm, life was slipping away. Rescue teams arrived in waves, with paramedics taking over CPR, working tirelessly to revive him. For more than an hour, they fought to save him. By 5:25 p.m., Eric was finally carried out of the cave on a stretcher. The cold air outside hit them like a wave, but they barely noticed. Eric was rushed to the hospital, where doctors administered IVs and cardiac drugs in a last-ditch effort. But despite all their efforts, it was too late. Eric Tzakle was pronounced dead, his life stolen in a flash by an unpredictable accident, one that none of his friends, despite all their experience and caution, could have foreseen. The cave that had seemed like a safer choice had turned into a tomb. David Rosler's story is a classic case of ignoring common sense and putting himself in a life-threatening situation due to poor judgment. Armed with no prior caving experience, David ventured into a notoriously tricky cave alone. Anyone with basic knowledge of cave exploration knows that the last thing you do is enter a hazardous environment without proper preparation or experience. Yet, that's exactly what he did. On the afternoon of February 11th, 2011, 26-year-old undergraduate David Rosler set out with a friend to explore the Stayhigh Cave in Virginia. The cave, notorious among local cavers for its treacherous entrance, requires those who enter to stay high, or position themselves on the upper part of a narrow V-shaped passage. By keeping their bodies elevated and carefully moving along the wider parts of the passage, cavers avoid the risk of getting stuck in the narrow crevices below. But for someone like David, who had no training or background in cave exploration, the subtle but crucial techniques necessary for navigating such a cave were lost. From the outset, David's lack of preparation showed. Despite understanding the basic requirement of staying high, he misjudged the danger. As he inched his way deeper into the cave, he gradually slipped toward the narrowest part of the V-shaped passage. The slick walls offered no grip, and before he could react, he was sliding uncontrollably downward. His body shot into the tightest part of the cave, where the rock walls closed in on him, compressing him into a space so tight that every breath became a struggle. As soon as he came to a stop, wedged painfully in the rock, panic set in. His arms were pinned against his sides, and every attempt to free himself made his situation worse. The jagged rocks dug into his skin, and the pressure on his chest made it hard to breathe. His leg was twisted at an awkward angle, adding a new layer of searing pain to his already desperate state. It felt as though the cave itself was squeezing the life out of him, and no matter how hard he tried to push himself up or twist free, the unforgiving rock wouldn't budge. Hours began to pass, and as his body remained locked in place, the pain intensified. The blood flow to his trapped leg began to slow, causing it to swell painfully. The pressure became unbearable. Every slight movement sent shocks of agony shooting up his leg and into his lower back as the rock dug deeper into his body. His muscles ached from the tension, and the cold, seeping through the walls of the cave, began to turn his pain into a deep, bone-chilling ache. At first, David's frustration kept him trying, kept him believing he could somehow break free. But soon, his initial anger turned into helplessness as his strength waned. His breathing became labored, not just from the tightness of the space, but from the growing realization that he might not make it out. His friend, hearing his distant cries for help from outside the cave, ran for assistance. But by the time rescuers arrived, David had already been trapped for what felt like an eternity. When the Newport Rescue Squad arrived, they quickly realized how critical the situation was. David wasn't just stuck. He was being crushed by the very cave itself. Despite their best efforts to pull him out, the rescuers found that each attempt only worsened his condition. His body was wedged so tightly that they couldn't free him without risking further injury. Desperation began to mount as the hours ticked by and the temperature continued to drop. By now, David's body was betraying him. His leg, twisted and crushed under his own weight, began to go numb. At first, it seemed like a blessing, as the sharp pain dulled into a strange, throbbing sensation. But as the numbness spread, David knew that the situation was becoming more dangerous. His circulation was compromised, and the lack of blood flow meant that hypothermia was becoming a real threat. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, chipping away at the rock to widen the passage around him. They brought in specialized tools and even debated the drastic measure of breaking David's hips just to maneuver him out of the crushing gap. But each inch of progress was agonizingly slow, and every time they tried to lift him, the pain surged through his body like fire. His leg was a constant source of agony. Trapped at an unnatural angle, every shift in position sent waves of unbearable pain coursing through him. The cold, too, was taking its toll. As the rescuers struggled to free him, they worried about how long David could hold on. Inside the cave, temperatures had dropped to dangerous levels, and the rescuers worked to keep him warm. They stuffed heat packs into his clothing and even used a hairdryer to blow warm air onto his body. But despite their best efforts, the cold air gnawed at his limbs, and David's strength was fading fast. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and he began slipping in and out of consciousness as the pain and exhaustion overwhelmed him. As the night wore on, David's reality became a haze of cold and pain. He could feel himself drifting, his body too exhausted to fight anymore. Every breath was a battle against the crushing pressure on his chest, and his leg felt like it was being torn apart from the inside. He tried to focus, to hold on for the rescuers, but his mind kept slipping into a dark, numb fog. But the rescuers refused to give up. They chipped away at the bedrock around him, hoisting his broken body upward little by little. Finally, after nearly 12 hours of grueling effort, David was freed. His body was limp as they pulled him from the cave, his skin pale from the cold, and his leg badly injured from the crush. He was immediately flown to Montgomery Regional Hospital, where doctors worked to treat his hypothermia and the severe crush injury that had nearly claimed his leg. David's survival was a miracle, but the pain he endured was beyond anything most people can imagine. In October 1989, 18-year-old Rachel Cox was on her first caving adventure at Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota. She and a group of college students were participating in a mock search and rescue operation after 2 weeks of exploring the cave. Deep beneath South Dakota's Wind Cave National Park, Rachel Cox thought she heard her instructor laughing from a nearby passage. She and a group of college students had been exploring the cave, but now they had split into teams, racing to find the instructors who were hiding in different parts of the cave. Cox convinced her team that the instructor was close by. She and a teammate left their backpacks behind and crawled through a narrow tunnel to investigate. However, when they reached the spot, the instructor wasn't there. Frustrated, her teammate criticized her decision and decided to head back. Cox, also annoyed, paused briefly before getting ready to follow him. That's when her lamp suddenly went out. In the pitch-black silence, Cox cursed herself for not noticing her lamp was low on fuel. Following her training, she decided to stay put and wait for help. But as more time passed, she considered trying to crawl back through the tunnel she had come from. She felt for the opening, squeezed through, and found herself in the wrong passage, even more lost than before. With no pack or working light, Cox was without food, water, or warmth. She knew her biggest danger was hypothermia, so she forced herself to keep moving. She made as much noise as she could, shouting, singing, banging her lamp against the cave walls, and even reciting lines from Shakespeare's "As You Like It" to stay calm and signal for help. Meanwhile, her fellow students and instructors were searching the area where she had disappeared. Rob McLeod, one of her teammates, said, "We had just spent 2 weeks in that cave, and we knew it pretty well. We didn't understand where she could be." Cox tried to retrace her steps, hoping to find the spot where she got lost. But instead, she ended up going deeper into the cave. As the hours stretched on in the cold darkness, hunger gnawed at Cox's stomach, making her feel weak and delirious. Her throat was parched, and her limbs felt heavy as if they didn't belong to her anymore. The lack of food and water twisted her mind, causing her thoughts to race and blur. At times, she wasn't sure if the strange noises around her were real or just her mind playing tricks. She began to hear whispers in the silence, voices from the cave, almost like it was alive, urging her to keep moving, even as exhaustion and starvation pushed her closer to madness. Cold, hungry, and desperate, time lost all meaning. And as her condition worsened, she thought she heard a gentle voice from the cave telling her, "I am the womb of Mother Earth. You are safe. I will birth you." She also saw visions of glowing lights and imagined her relatives praying for her return. As the search dragged on with no sign of Cox, the instructors notified the park rangers. The National Park Service quickly mobilized more cavers, starting with locals and then reaching out to experts from other states. Jim Nepstad, a former Wind Cave specialist, got the call on Monday evening. He flew in from Kentucky and helped coordinate the search. Wind Cave is the easiest cave in the world to get lost in, Nepstad explained. The passages are so dense, it's a three-dimensional maze. After about 30 hours of searching, Nepstad and his team expanded their search to more remote parts of the cave. One of the volunteers finally heard Cox's call for help after hearing rocks fall in the distance. Cox recalled seeing a light approaching, and then a man with a beard asking, "Rachel, are you ready to leave now?" She was so disoriented that she replied, "Are you God?" It took another 2 hours to pull Cox out of the cave. She was weak, dehydrated, and mildly hypothermic, but she had no serious injuries. After a night in the hospital, she was reunited with her father, who had flown in to see her. Later that day, she rejoined her group at their campsite. Though physically fine, Cox was overwhelmed by shame for the mistakes she had made. She couldn't stop thinking about how her actions had triggered such a large search effort, and she worried about the damage that may have been caused to the cave's fragile environment. For many years, Cox believed that being trapped in the cave was the most traumatic thing she would ever face. On April 22, 2023, Carl O'Keefe set out for what was supposed to be a joyous day of celebration with his family. The 49-year-old father of 3 from Lancaster, England, had planned a trip to the Kong Adventure Centre in Keswick, Cumbria, to mark his niece's birthday. The day was filled with excitement as Carl, his children, and other family members looked forward to exploring the various activities offered at the center, which was known for its indoor climbing walls, adventure playgrounds, and an intricate indoor caving system. The Kong Adventure Center is located in the heart of the Lake District National Park. Its man-made indoor caves, made of fiberglass, were designed to mimic real caving environments. While the caves were advertised as family-friendly, some visitors had expressed concerns about the tunnels being too small for adults. But Carl, filled with excitement and the desire to make memories with his kids, didn't think twice about joining them in the caves. Once inside, Carl's children scrambled easily through the narrow passages, their smaller frames fitting comfortably in the tight twists and turns of the cave. But Carl, who was of average build, quickly realized the caves were far tighter than he had anticipated. The space grew narrower as he tried to maneuver through the tunnel, and it became increasingly difficult for him to continue. Still, Carl persisted, trying to keep up with his kids. What happened next is unclear, but it's believed that Carl attempted to turn around in one of the tight sections of the cave. In doing so, he wedged himself into a crevice, becoming completely stuck. Unable to move forward or backward, Carl was trapped. The confined space made it impossible for him to free himself. He tried to stay calm, but the reality of his situation soon set in. He was immobilized, alone in the dark, and struggling to breathe. Carl's children, realizing something was wrong, scrambled back to where they had entered the cave and alerted the adults. The Adventure Center's staff quickly arrived at the scene. They assessed the situation and immediately set to work, trying to free Carl by hand. With ropes and brute strength, they tried pulling him out. But the narrowness of the passage and Carl's position made it impossible. After several failed attempts, the staff realized they needed outside help and called for emergency services. Within minutes, the police, fire department, and ambulance teams arrived, followed by the Keswick Mountain Rescue Team, who were experienced in cave rescues. The urgency of the situation grew, as Carl had already been trapped for nearly an hour. The emergency responders quickly realized that the situation was more complex than anticipated. Carl was deeply wedged in the tunnel, and pulling him out wasn't an option. His breathing had become labored, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. With the clock ticking, the rescue teams called in additional reinforcements, including the Cumbria Mines Rescue Unit and the Hazardous Area Response Team. These specialized groups were trained to handle high-risk situations in confined spaces. While the emergency services worked on possible evacuation plans, staff at the Adventure Center and concerned onlookers began dismantling parts of the climbing wall to gain better access to the cave system. Finally, after 4 hours and 7 minutes of relentless effort, the team managed to free Carl from the cave. He was unresponsive, but they rushed him to a nearby hospital in critical condition. For 10 days, Carl's family kept vigil by his side, hoping for a miracle. But despite the best efforts of the intensive care team, it became clear that Carl's injuries were too severe. On May 2nd, 2023, Carl passed away, surrounded by his family. The cause of death was determined to be crush injuries, sustained from being stuck in the cave for an extended period. His sister later spoke to the media, describing the devastating impact the accident had on their family. "He was my baby brother, and over the last few years, he became my best friend. I'm broken, as are the rest of our family," she said in her statement. Carl O'Keefe's tragic death shocked the local community and raised serious concerns about the safety of the indoor cave system at the Kong Adventure Center. Prior to the incident, several visitors had expressed concerns about the tightness of the tunnels, warning that they were too small for adults and could potentially lead to accidents. One reviewer had even written that it wasn't a question of if, but when someone would get seriously hurt. Despite these warnings, the center had not imposed any restrictions on adult participation in the caves. In the wake of Carl's death, the center faced increased scrutiny, and an investigation into the incident was launched. As of now, the inquest into Carl's death remains pending, and the full details of what went wrong have yet to be made public. The group of 31 adventurers gathered early one chilly January morning in 1970, bundled up against the biting winter air. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way to Knox Cave. Knox Cave had a reputation for its most notorious feature, the gun barrel. The gun barrel was a keyhole-shaped tunnel, just 18 inches wide and 60 feet long, that squeezed anyone brave enough to enter. For many, crawling through this impossibly tight space was a badge of honor. It separated casual explorers from those truly willing to push their limits. Most of the group was determined to pass through the gun barrel and reach the untouched sections of the cave that lay beyond. It was the ultimate test, both physically and mentally. After hiking through the snow-filled forest, the group arrived at the entrance, a snow-covered sinkhole leading into the cave's cold, dark mouth. One by one, they descended into the depths, the temperature dropping as they left the world of light behind. The atmosphere inside the cave was eerie, with only the sound of dripping water and the soft scuffling of boots on rock to accompany them. 19 of the group decided to tackle the gun barrel, among them 14-year-old Peter Viennes. It was Peter's first caving trip, and he was eager to prove himself. He watched as the others entered the tight passage ahead of him, crawling on their bellies through the narrow opening. Some moved quickly, confident in their ability, while others hesitated, inching forward cautiously. When it was Peter's turn, he took a deep breath and plunged in. The tunnel was tighter than anything he had ever imagined. His body scraped against the rough, jagged rock walls as he wriggled forward, using his elbows and knees to inch along. The air was thin, and his breathing was shallow. Every few feet, he paused to catch his breath, the weight of the rock pressing in on him. He was just 8 feet from the exit when disaster struck. As Peter pushed himself forward, his knee slipped into a narrow crevice in the floor. At first, he thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd pull it free and keep going. But when he tried to yank it out, his knee wouldn't budge. Panic gripped him. He tried again, twisting and pulling, but each attempt only made things worse. His knee was stuck fast, wedged in the rock. Peter called out, his voice shaking with fear. The group ahead of him, unaware of his predicament, kept moving forward until one by one, they realized something was wrong. Shouts echoed through the cave as they called back to him. When Peter explained his situation, the group quickly turned around, but they soon realized they were in a terrible situation themselves. Peter's body was blocking the narrow tunnel, preventing anyone from moving forward or backward. They were trapped. The attempts to free Peter began almost immediately. The cavers tried pulling on his leg, twisting it, shifting his body, but nothing worked. Every tug caused Peter to cry out in pain, and eventually, they had to stop. The group was stuck in the cold, cramped tunnel, with no way forward and no way back. Time passed slowly, and the cave's natural chill began to seep into their bones. The temperature was dropping, and hypothermia became a very real threat. The cavers could do nothing but wait, huddling together for warmth and comfort in the narrow passage. The younger members of the group, especially Peter, were terrified, while the older cavers tried their best to stay calm and keep the situation under control. Outside the cave, the rest of the group grew anxious. Hours had passed with no sign of the others returning, and something felt wrong. One of them decided to venture into the cave to check on the others, and when he reached the gun barrel, he was horrified by what he found. Peter was trapped, and the rest of the group was stuck behind him. He quickly rushed back to the surface to raise the alarm. By the time police officers and firefighters arrived at the scene, it was already late afternoon. The rescuers examined the situation and realized that this was no ordinary cave rescue. The narrowness of the gun barrel made it impossible for them to simply pull Peter free, and any sudden movements could cause him severe injury. Hours dragged on as they tried various methods to lift his leg out of the crevice, but nothing worked. At one point, Peter, delirious with fear and exhaustion, began screaming about a snake biting him, though there was no snake, just his mind playing tricks in the dark, cold cave. As the sun set, the situation became increasingly desperate. The temperature inside the cave was dropping dangerously low, and if they couldn't free Peter soon, the cold could claim not just him, but the others trapped behind him. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., after 7 long hours of struggle, the rescuers came up with a new plan. They handed a thermos of soapy water down to the group, hoping to lubricate Peter's knee and free it from the crevice. Slowly, they poured the soapy water around his leg, and the firefighters tied a rope around his ankle. This time, they coordinated their efforts with the group inside the cave, carefully pulling on Peter's leg while those inside wriggled beside him, easing the pressure on his knee. Finally, Peter's knee began to shift. With one last gentle pull, it popped free from the crevice. Relief washed over everyone, but they couldn't celebrate yet. Peter was still in a dangerous position, and they had to make sure he didn't slip back into the slot. Carefully, they guided him the rest of the way through the tight passage until he was finally clear. The group behind him was then able to crawl out to safety, one by one, exhausted but unharmed. Peter's legs sustained fractures and bruises. He was treated for hypothermia, and then admitted for a few days so that his leg could make a full recovery. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. For the 8th grade students at Tadcaster Grammar School in the United Kingdom, the annual overnight trip to Burley Park Outdoor Education Center was the highlight of their school year. Excitement buzzed through the group as they piled onto the bus, waving goodbye to their parents. It was a week of freedom, camping, hiking, and outdoor exploration, free from the routine of classrooms and schoolwork. Among the students were Joseph, Amy, and Charlie, 3 close friends, thrilled to be away in the wilds of North Yorkshire. At 13 and 14, they were on the cusp of starting high school, with Christmas break just around the corner. Little did they know, this trip would soon turn into their worst nightmare. On the first day, the group of 100 students split into smaller groups for various activities. While some went hiking or rock climbing, Joseph, Amy, and Charlie, along with 8 other classmates and their math teacher, were set for a cave exploration led by a 17-year-old guide. Their destination was the Manchester Hole, a cave system known for its hidden chambers and tunnels beneath the surface. The adventure started with nervous excitement as they squeezed into the small entrance of the cave. What seemed like a tiny hole in the ground opened into a vast chamber, with a ceiling rising 50 feet above them. The floor was covered in a few inches of water, but their rubber boots kept them dry as they splashed around, marveling at the stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Led deeper into the cave system, the students passed through more tunnels and chambers, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. But soon, they reached a narrow tunnel, just wide enough to crawl through. To move forward, they would have to get on their hands and knees and wriggle through the 40-foot passage. Though nervous, the students followed one another, squeezing through the muddy tunnel until they reached a second chamber. But something felt wrong. The water in this chamber was much deeper, reaching their knees. The air was colder, and their excitement faded as they realized they were standing in a pool of icy water. The guide was concerned. This chamber wasn't supposed to have this much water, and there hadn't been any rain. It was clear they needed to get back to the surface, but the only way out was through the narrow tunnel they had just crawled through. The guide instructed the teacher to lead the students back, while he would stay behind to make sure everyone got out safely. The students, now scared, began crawling back through the tunnel, but as they moved, a surge of water rushed in, flooding the passage. Panic erupted as they realized the water was rising faster than they could crawl. Screams echoed through the tunnel as the group frantically pushed forward. The worst part came when they reached the sump, a section of the tunnel that had completely filled with water. To escape, the students would need to hold their breath and swim through the submerged passage. Charlie, one of the braver students, told the others they had no choice. With a deep breath, he dove underwater, disappearing into the tunnel. Amy and Joseph were at the back of the group with the guide close behind. The air pockets were quickly vanishing as the water continued to rise. The guide urged Amy to dive, telling her there was no time to wait. Terrified, Amy took a breath and plunged into the freezing water, pulling herself through the narrow, dark tunnel. Rocks jutted out, scraping her arms as she swam, her lungs burning from the effort. Just when she thought she couldn't go any further, a hand grabbed her arm and pulled her through the final stretch of the tunnel. It was the guide, who had managed to pull her to safety. Amy gasped for air, but when she looked around, Joseph was nowhere to be seen. Joseph had been right behind her, but when he reached the last air pocket, it had already disappeared. Without air to breathe, he was trapped. The water had filled the tunnel completely, leaving him with no way out. Above ground, the remaining students and teachers emerged into daylight, shocked to see clear skies. There had been no rain, so where had the water come from? In a terrible coincidence, gusts of wind at a nearby reservoir had caused a surge of water to spill over the dam, sending thousands of gallons of water into the river. The cave system, which normally drained slowly, was overwhelmed by the sudden torrent, filling the tunnels in a matter of minutes. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but it was too late. Inside the cave, Joseph's body was found in the flooded tunnel, unable to escape the sudden surge of water. What should have been an exciting adventure had turned into a tragedy. The incident shook the community. Investigations were launched, and the county council that operated the outdoor center faced questions about safety protocols. Why had no one checked the reservoir before sending students? However, no charges were filed. The authorities ruled it a tragic accident, one that could not have been predicted. For Joseph's family and classmates, the pain of that day would never fade. What began as a thrilling adventure in the wild turned into a heartbreaking loss. On the 1st of September 2015, a man decided to take his loyal companion, a small cattle dog, on an adventure that would soon turn into a nightmare. The sinking river cave system, with its deep pits and winding passages, was no place for a dog, let alone a human who failed to understand the risks. But this pet owner, blinded by the thrill of exploration, brought his dog along on a journey that would lead to a daunting fate. As they ventured near the cave, the dog's playful curiosity became its undoing. With one careless misstep, the cattle dog tumbled into a blind pit, a sheer 169-foot drop into darkness. The man stood at the edge, staring down into the abyss. Panic set in, but instead of trying to save his faithful companion, he assumed the worst. He feared that his dog didn't make it, and instead of making a rescue attempt, he walked away, leaving the dog behind in the cold, unforgiving depths of the cave. The truth, however, was completely different. The dog had survived the fall. She called out her owner with her squeaky voice, but unfortunately, he never heard her cries. For weeks, the small cattle dog, weighing no more than 30 pounds, clung to life. Trapped in the sinking river cave, she was there without food or water, weakened and dehydrated, but not without hope. Day after day, she waited, listening to the echoes of the cave, hoping that someone, anyone, might come to her rescue. At every sound, she must have rushed to the narrow opening of the pit, gazing upward, yearning for the sight of rescue. The darkness for such a traumatized animal must be suffocating, but even worse was the silence that filled the void. It was a silence that should have never existed, a silence created by an owner who gave up on her too soon. 3 long weeks passed before fate finally intervened. A group of cavers, Mel Edie Pumplin, Rich Pumplin, Mary Klaus, John Scow, and Becky Kaufman, arrived at the same cave system on a different mission. They had set their sights on the very pit that had swallowed the dog, Colorado's deepest, their goal to descend and explore the depths. Unaware of the hidden tragedy below, they prepared for a routine day of caving. Rich Pumplin was the first to rappel down. As he descended into the pit, the familiar sound of shifting gravel beneath his feet was suddenly interrupted by something else, something alive. His voice echoed back to the team above, his tone shifting as he called out to them. Mel, listening from the surface, recognized the way he was speaking. It was the same soft tone he used when talking to animals. They thought it was a small creature, maybe a chipmunk. But when Rich returned to the surface, his expression told a different story. "There's a dog down there," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Put on your small party rescue hats." The team sprang into action. Mary Klaus, who had a soft spot for animals, quickly volunteered to go down and help. She grabbed a large backpack and some supplies, including snacks that she thought might be suitable for a dog, and rappelled into the pit. When she reached the bottom, her heart sank at the sight before her. There, in the dim light of her headlamp, was a small, frail cattle dog, looking up at her with eyes full of exhaustion and silent pleas for help. To Mary's astonishment, the dog had no visible injuries, but her condition was dire. She was weak, starved, and dehydrated. Yet somehow, she remained calm. The poor thing was barely holding on. But when Mary spoke softly to her, something amazing happened. The dog's tail began to wag. In that moment, Mary realized the dog wasn't just waiting for rescue. She was waiting for kind interaction that she was deprived of for weeks. The dog slowly approached, her trust unwavering. Mary fed her a few snacks, and despite the dog's weakened state, the two connected instantly. Initially, the team considered using a rope system to pull the dog up, but they quickly realized how terrifying and traumatic that experience would be for the poor animal. Being dragged up against rough rock walls was not an option. Instead, Mary decided she would carry the dog out on her back. As they carefully placed the dog inside the backpack, the little cattle dog rested her head against Mary's shoulder, her body calm and still. With the dog secured, Mary began the long, steady climb out of the pit. To her amazement, the dog was completely at peace. trusting her new friend without hesitation. The dog's calmness was almost unnerving. Mary even checked to make sure she was still awake. But when they reached the surface, the little dog sprang from the backpack with newfound energy. She wiggled her tail furiously and darted around, hopping and rolling in the dirt. The rescuers couldn't help but smile as they watched her, feeling as though her boundless happiness was her way of saying thank you. They tried to guide her back to camp, thinking she might need more help, but the dog had other ideas. She ran off in the opposite direction, her tail wagging as if she knew exactly where she was going. The team couldn't help but wonder if she was a stray, living off the land. News of the dog's rescue spread quickly through the caving community, and several weeks later, another group of cavers encountered the same dog again. Only this time, she wasn't alone. She was with her owner, the very man who had assumed she was lost forever after watching her fall into the pit. The owner was overwhelmed when he recounted his story. He had believed his beloved dog was gone for good, too heartbroken to even attempt a rescue. But 3 weeks later, to his absolute shock, she appeared at his home, tail wagging and eyes filled with forgiveness. Despite the fact that he had given up on her, the little cattle dog had come back to him, showing no sign of resentment.